I'm Dr. Hans Toki, and this is a tutorial about the Man on the Mountain project, and really a reflection about the project. The Man on the Mountain story is a metaphorical story that I created to help students analyze and try to understand critically the whole process of research. In order to do this assignment effectively, you really have to go into the OER, the Open Educational Resource, really the academic web, and go through various research terms that were indicated in the assignment, from the longitudinal research to cases to variables and so on and so forth. Because in the story itself, I've embedded all sorts of vignettes and elements that are related directly to doing research, both problems and successes that we can see in a research project. I just want to highlight a few of these, and then you can go back to the story if you wish and try to understand it yourself and unpack many other terms that are buried in the story. First of all is the research question itself. Most students say this is about the man on the mountain, because that's what the story is titled to be. And originally with the anthropology student, this is true. But if you listen to the story carefully, at a certain point in time, the focus shifts away from the man to the microorganism, and then shifts towards some sort of sea creature, and then ultimately some sort of fish icon that has rituals and roles and religious beliefs amongst various indigenous peoples in 3 different parts of the world. So the connecting point is not a man. The connecting point is mountains and this fish-like creature. This happens in research a lot, that we start with one question and then something emerges from the data that shifts it slightly and in some ways opens a whole new field of study. The anthropology student began with his view of it based simply on one myth that had been written in a book. We don't know, according to the story, whether the man existed or not, or whether that's a myth story, but what we do have is actual evidence in bones and in drawings and in story. And indeed, you can see by the river, they have the fish hanging by the side of the river, that there is something about fish that live in this river that matters to these indigenous people. So the research question shifts. Second thing, cases. There are actually 4 cases studying this, if you actually capture it. The first one is when the anthropology student goes on a mission on his own. The second time, when they go up the same mountain, the same research field, with an interdisciplinary approach with this fellow female student. We don't know if it's romance or not. It's never stated. In the second case, which it becomes now interdisciplinary with biology and anthropology together. The third case, when this story is picked up on the other side of the world as a mountain story by the crazy rich Asian. And then the fourth case, which many students miss, is where the conference is finally being held, where the data comes out, is a indigenous researcher who has gone back to his home island to look at the same thing. So we have 4 cases. What this shows is how research snowballs or builds on itself. One research goes to the next, to the next, to the next. This is longitudinal research. From one case that builds to the next case, that builds to the next case, that builds to the next case, and data emerges from this. You'll notice in many academic articles where they'll say the limitations on this research at the very end. And the reason they do that is they say, this is what we studied in our case. So you could use this data to pick up on new things that need to be studied. And in certain academic articles, you'll notice this, that they'll things that need to be studied that is not addressed in this particular research. Then there are other elements here. You can see interdisciplinary approach. We know there's anthropology. We know there's biology because that's clear from the beginning. The crazy rich Asian, we don't know, but what we do know is he brings in many other disciplines and research methods into it. Indeed, technology starts almost to take over the story. But there's new methodology that he starts using. So we're not exactly sure with the Crazy Rich Asian if he even has a major field or if he's just simply doing all of it. And in the fourth case, there's obviously something here about a professor who has a background as an indigenous person doing a culture study, very sociologically, very historical. So we have dancing around this project several disciplines. This is the power of interdisciplinary research, is it shows different data. As long as they can be sympathetic to each other, no one element dominates. The problem with some of us is we will only look at things through our own eyes and through our own method and through our own bias, really. This story forces us to look beyond what we first think and our own first bias to see what actually merges. Another element here is methodology. We see qualitative methodology very much used in anthropology, and I deliberately chose Anth because Malinowski comes to us from anthropology to talk about ethnography and how ethnography, the research of a culture and a people, is the effective means for researching from observational. So in qualitative, we see participant observation, where in order to get to that qualitative data, which is observing things and seeing things, you had to go onto the site itself. Thus, the anthropology student recognized right out of the gate, I've got to go march up the mountain. Very anthropological in its view. Now, with that in mind, we then come across the biology student. Now, biology in and of itself as a field tends to be more calculable, is a good way to put it, counting things and putting numbers and data to it. So in him pushing her to become a participant observer, she no longer can simply go to lab results at the university. She's got to go on the mountain herself and gather samples. So we see then biology coming in, being forced into the qualitative field, but emerging out of it with quantitative data. She actually could verify what he had seen and written in his own anthropological notes that was rejected initially. So once you had the quantitative data from biology, she could write an article. And so she, saddened by the fact he left college, ends up writing out the article just as something to finish the grant or whatever it might have been the case. And we have then a mixed methods project. So that's qual at work, mixed methods. Another thing of methodology is important to see here. We see participant observation and the use of written notes, jot notes, hand notes that are autographs of what I actually saw. So if you're a legitimate verified observer, someone would know that this is what they saw. They're not just faking this. But to verify this to be true, excuse me, I just knocked my cough, knocked this camera. Let's fix it there. There you go. What the verification comes is in these Polaroid shots. Now, some of you should have known, by it being Polaroid, this is not a modern era, because if it was a modern era, you would have seen it done with a camera, click camera, right? Or a phone camera. So as clearly as in the 70s at some point. That should have time-stamped it for some of you, that the data collection here isn't right now. It is historical. So we have this taking place during a Polaroid area. She makes instant photographs. Why this works is it has a timestamp on it that's when it was taken. That verifies things. Then she tries to gather the bone. Now we have the ethical issue. The anthropologist is very concerned about the spirit world and the transcendent world and the world behind projects, which a biologist generally doesn't think about. It's really material world. So we have this conflict between the material world and the spiritual world. He doesn't want to upset this because he thinks it's unethical as an anthropologist to upset the site. Her, as a biologist, is interested in whether this data actually is useful. And she steals, really, a piece of bone, depending on your point of view. The scientist says we at least have to have some data to verify that what he says is true or whether it's a myth. So we have methodology and ethics. Then an interesting thing happens a generation later when the agent is looking for a project with unlimited budgets. This crazy rich dad and a crazy rich Asian. Playing off of the movie, of course. He says, I'm going to put everything we can in current technology and innovate new technology in how to actually research a site. And now we have the methodology of technology being used. This really plays to our idea of the cinematic montage and using camera and images to understand a scene. And he goes as far as to get x-rays of the place and also doing laser scans of all the mountains, live upstream satellite beaming back to the university so you can have a whole room full of analysts on what is actually going on here. So it's the ultimate in a technological, web-oriented research project. It's not it's not biology. It's just this thing that happens. Indeed, if I were to walk in the shoes of the crazy rich Asian, I'm not sure he actually knows what he's doing, except he knows this. If I throw money at it in my dad's name, it'll make me look good with my dad. And at the end of the day, I am interested in research. And so in the third case, we see the methodology of technology. In the fourth case, which isn't long, and I deliberately keep it short, we see historical, where an indigenous person from an island has been around the academic field and has seen this talk, probably because it was exposed globally by the crazy rich Asian from being a hidden book in some library a generation ago with the mythical people. Now is this kind of global story. Say that I have comparative ideas myself. So he goes into his history to rediscover the cultural history of his island. This is archival research that you will encounter in many elements of social research, where you have to understand the history of the place. And in this case, the history of the place isn't given to us by the anthropologist as it probably should have. It's given to us what? By who? The person who has a personal contact with the indigenous people and can communicate and has lived there. Some other things to think about. What are the variables? The variables are the terrain. The variable is what is it about the fish? There's different types of them. Variables are the opinion and bias of what we choose to look at. A variable might be the geography that dictates the research, and even weather that dictates the research. Could you do this in the middle of winter? Probably not. In the middle of winter, would we find different data? It might look different to you. So there's variations on this. So variables are out there. What's an independent variable? What an independent variable means, it works on its own without anything affecting it. This would certainly be the microorganism, and some would argue that this also is the cottage and the temple, as things that don't change, even when its environments and weather and so on might change. So that's another piece of it that you could look at. Then along the way, there's various issues involved in research. Obvious one here is money. When you have money to continue and you get grant funds, or your parents can pay for it, you can continue the research. Sadly for our anthropologist, he ran out of money, and because he couldn't follow up on his work, and his work wasn't deemed as quality work, he was suspended from the school and he left. In her case, She didn't see a long-term track on this research benefiting her in her biology career. So she finishes the project because she was bound to it, but then leaves it and doesn't do any of the follow-up work, and it sits for a generation as a limited article to a specific little group. Much research can turn out of this. Once the grant funding is up, somebody says, I'm done with this. Research fatigue or research boredom can even set in where someone says, I've done enough of this, I can't do it. In her case, I don't know. This is for you to think about. Was she heartbroken that she thought maybe there was more to this between him and her? And so there's a romance piece? I don't know. That caused her to shift back strictly to her biology. And of course, money as far as being able to use technology is all over this with the Crazy Rich Asian being able to muster anything he wants to do. Plus hire a cruise ship. For goodness sakes, I'd like to be at that conference and paying for everybody to come. So income is one thing. The people themselves shift. Then there's other interesting vignettes of the approaches. One student has remarked in the past about the waterfall scenario where he says, I want to jump. Let's go jump. And she goes, no, that's not responsible. Well, here you have the dilemma between an artistic, risk-taking researcher who will go over the waterfall and do it versus the cautious researcher who will do things only in safety. So we have research that's risky, research that's safe, and we find this conflict between the two of them in a vignette like that. And it pictures itself in other parts of the story, but especially in that vignette. And as I mentioned earlier, ethics, where they stay, how they are in their tents separately, how they don't camp right by the cabin or, God forbid, inside the cabin, the ethics of where do I place myself in the research field as a participant observer in order to be conscious to what's going on around me. Finally, in the end of the day, we end up at a conference. And this is ultimately where world-class research ends up, in these global conferences, academic conferences. And here the best of the best have been put together to present these 4 cases based on the Crazy Rich Asian really finding the original #1 article that came out. I don't know what your opinion is of what happened, but here we have an elderly woman who's lived a life on campus as a biology professor, intrigued by coming back to hear about this. And of course, the Crazy Rich Asian up there being proud. And then the ultimate research being this indigenous person. We think we might have the answer to all of this, which is the indigenous person. But the backstory is, even when you leave college, you still might have a backstory that I wish I'd done that. And thus we have our businessman now, our barista businessman who's been very successful in life, owns a catering business and several coffee shops, including the one that he bought, now is at the conference. Is he there to see what actually happens? Or is he there for other reasons? I'll leave that for you to decide. But the Man on the Mountain story has lots about research into it. If you're interested, cycle back to it. I'll be creating a transcript at some point, and maybe even a little book to try and help us to unpack this. Have a great day, everybody.